The Dodge Caliber launched in 2007 with a worldwide push. This was one of the saviors of Chrysler, and it was an abject failure. So today I'm going to talk about a little bit about the history of the concept of the marketing of the design and my personal feelings on the Caliber and why it failed in the market. So stay tuned. So first off, welcome back. Please subscribe to this channel. Mash that like button, please. It helps me with the YouTube algorithm. But the Caliber was the replacement for the Dodge Neon, and it came out in 2007. It was introduced in 2005 as a concept car and ended up looking very much like the concept car did. And I have a personal experience with this vehicle, and I'm going to share a little bit of it here in two different portions. But I think it's really important to understand Chrysler and their marketing and everything else around it. So this is a video we're going to dig in a little bit deep on. Now, the first is that the Neon was released in, I believe, 95, if I remember correctly, and I owned one. Here's the first part of my personal story here's the story. I graduated from college. I got married 2 weeks later, and my wife's car promptly stopped working. We needed a car, and we looked over a weekend, so we considered the imports, Chevy, Pontiac, and the Neon, and we decided on the Neon. And I'll never forget, we found a dealership open on a Sunday and went and bought a Neon. It was a two-door base-level Neon, automatic transmission. It was great, but it was my wife's car, and we loved it for years. The Neon was super sporty. It was so much fun to drive. It was noisy. The engine wasn't exactly refined. It didn't ride great, but it had really good interior space, good dashboard design, although cheap materials, space for our child when we had one, and we loved it for years. But somewhere between, I think it was 70 and 80,000 miles, it started to really develop a lot of problems. We had electrical gremlins. The radio wouldn't work. One of the windows maybe wouldn't go up. They would fix themselves, of course. And then the transmission would slip when it rained, which was more serious. And then one day the head gasket blew, and we decided we were just done. We needed something else, and we moved on. That is the first and the last Dodge car I have ever owned, although in all fairness, I have owned a couple of Jeeps. But the Neon went through two different generations, and Chrysler was looking for a replacement. And that's where the idea behind the Caliber came from. Now, it's important, it's very important to understand the ownership of Chrysler at these times. The Neon was released in 95, and I think it was in 98, Chrysler was merged with Daimler, and they became Daimler Chrysler. Now, this merger of equals was not equal, and history has written a lot of articles about that merger and how it all happened, but generally you can bundle it down to Chrysler was considered a little fiefdom, and it was starved of resources. You can look at the simple fact that the Chrysler 300 was a previous generation E-Class from Mercedes that Chrysler was basically given and said, here, go build a car. So in the midst of $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 sales for mid-sized cars like the Accord and the Camry, Chrysler was given a large car, basic interior, sometimes really good power. Now, I kind of like what Chrysler does. I'll be honest with you. Some of their modern marketing I don't agree with so much, but I like how they have a different approach to it. And they have done a really good job, certainly over about a 30-year period, of identifying spaces in the market and then creating a product for it. Think about the Chrysler K car. It was not the first front engine, front wheel drive, compact car in America. It wasn't the first one by an American manufacturer, but it did the best job and saved the company. The Dodge and Chrysler and Plymouth minivans were a market that nobody knew existed. Customers who wanted something like a station wagon to hold all their stuff and their children, but didn't want a full-size van, the minivan stepped in and they revolutionized the industry. Products like the Jeep Cherokee, unibody construction, but 4 doors, revolutionized sport utilities, and then the Jeep Grand Cherokee came out. A product like the Dodge Ram 1500 that was very polarizing, but people who loved it bought it. And so Chrysler division, right, had a pretty long history at that point of finding areas in the market where there was a lot of demand. And they offered a lot of generic products, certainly the Dodge Shadow and things like that, boxy, boring, not terribly exciting, and not as reliable as the imports. And that's where they tried to compete. But along the way, they came up with the Neon, a small car that could be profitable, but had a ton of personality, and it was a big success, selling, in the $130,000 range. That's pretty good, but at the time, the Civic, for example, was selling over $300,000, over $250,000. It was a big success, but it wasn't killing the imports. But the Neon was 2 generations in, it was getting a little long in the tooth, and they needed to replace it with something different. And unfortunately, Chrysler decided they wanted to replace the Neon and the PT Cruiser with one vehicle. And that's the genesis of the problem here. So what they did is they came up with the Caliber. And again, in 2005, they released it as a concept car. And in 2007, when it was released to the public, it looked largely the same. It's a good looking car. And unfortunately, it tried to do too much for too many people. Now, here's personal story number 2. I was really excited about it when it came out. I liked the idea that it was a small car, but with a higher seating position. I personally love hatchbacks. Situate ourselves here. I personally love hatchbacks, and I was very interested. So I went to a dealership, and I won't name the dealership here in my city, but they are horrible. They have a horrible reputation. And in their case, even though I was driving the cheapest car on their lot, they wouldn't let me drive it. They wanted to hold my driver's license and hold the keys to my personal car, right? It was ridiculous. So finally they agreed if the salesman drove it off the lot. So we did. And I'll never forget, they had a plastic cover in the back, and he had left his screwdriver in it. So while I drove it, that screwdriver, but bang, bang, side to side. It was a horrible, horrible experience, and I left, needless to say, without buying it. So what was the reviews? Well, they were a little bit mixed. Car and driver kind of liked it. They liked the engine and how it rode and the concept behind it. Consumer Reports was less favorable, that the noisy engine fit and finish was subpar, ride quality was sound but unexceptional, and the continuously variable, there we go, transmission works well, but everything lacked punch. And that was my overall opinion as well. I drove the base engine with the base transmission, and it was just meh. And that's the overwhelming desire. So looking at, what was available, first off is the Chrysler and Daimler partnered with Mitsubishi and came up with this platform. And it was intended to be a global platform. And they turned that into the Caliber, and they offered 3 different engines, a 1.8 liter, a 2 liter, and a 2.4 liter, all world engines. Now, those world engines were designed between Daimler, Mitsubishi, and Hyundai. So when you think of the mid-2000s and you think of reliability, durability, and refinement, you think of Mitsubishi and Hyundai, don't you? Yeah. So these engines were a little bit rough, a little underpowered, and they were mated with a CVT or a CV transmission made by Jatco. Jatco is made by Nissan. Nissan's reliability issues have largely been attributed to its transmissions, which are provided by Jatco. So, we're not starting off with a great basis here. But generally speaking, the reviews were largely positive in different ways. It had good, the car had good interior space, good visibility. It was okay. It didn't accelerate great. It didn't have great gas mileage. It didn't handle very well, even in the highest level trims, and Dodge was offering SRT, RT, and SXT versions of it to provide more power, but it still didn't handle well because the higher seating position. And I think this is just an example of all the compromises that Dodge and Chrysler tried to make in this vehicle. See, if they just tried to replace the Neon, which was a good handling and a beast in the top mode, they would have been okay, but they tried to cover too many bases at once. Now, part of me, when I was preparing for this video, was to say that the Caliber was a forerunner of the small sport utility segment, but that's not true. The CR-V came out in 1995. So while in the mid-2000s, certainly sport utilities were ascendant, they were continuing to rise. This is an interesting take a la the Toyota Matrix. It wasn't revolutionary. So when you look at Chrysler and their products at the time, think about the Chrysler Pacifica, which was some kind of weird sport utility minivan comparison. Big and heavy, slow and bubulous. Consider the Dodge Magnum, which was supersized, incredibly powerful, but it was only available in a station wagon form. Chrysler went from what I talked about earlier of finding a market and providing a car to it and finding niches and selling niche products. And you could see that in their sales. They had moderate success, 50, 80,000 sales with some of their products, but that's not what Chrysler needs. As the third largest manufacturer, they needed home runs, and they needed to be able to beat the more established manufacturers one-to-one in a comparison test and be more reliable. But that wasn't what Daimler was investing in. They were trying to cut costs, increase profitability by cutting those costs specifically out of the interior and reusing platforms. And that's where the Caliber came in. So when the Caliber came out, it was okay. It was pretty well reviewed in some ways, and other ways it wasn't. It wasn't terribly competitive, but it was. It sold over 100,000 for a few years. But again, when you're looking at a Civic that sold 300 and some odd thousand, the Caliber was a little low. But the Caliber was intended to be a world car. This was intended to be sold in almost 100 countries and be one of the products, I think it was the second one, that was supposed to penetrate the Chinese market. They sold it, for a few years and then just eventually gave up in 2012, 2013. My thoughts on the product are this. The basic engines were unrefined. They were noisy. The transmission made it feel less responsive than the horsepower would lead you to believe. It didn't handle very well because you sat up higher. Compared to the Neon, the Caliber sat 4 inches. Your eye level sat 4 inches higher. So it tended to roll a little more. Even in the highest level trims, although it had a lot of power, it didn't handle that well. The steering was vague. But most importantly, the interior was cheap. Now, if you're being fair. It was very clean. It was a clean design. But I remember, I think it was Car and Driver actually said that the interior looked like it had been from Fisher-Price toys, that it had all been melted down and turned gray. Something like that. And that's true. It was the cheapest plastic you could imagine. It was boring. And they added some cool things to the Caliber. They added the cool zone in the glove compartment, so you could put some drinks in there and have them cool down. They added flip down speakers at the back hatch. That was super cool. In the center armrest, they had a flip area where you could put a cell phone. But all of these were novelties and missed the entire point that people want a comprehensive, refined, well-priced, fuel-efficient, competent product. And the Caliber wasn't it. It was a neat idea, but it tried to straddle too many genres at the same time. Was it a small car? Did it replace the PT Cruiser as a tall hatchback? Was it a small sport utility vehicle because it offered all-wheel drive with some of the performance versions? It offered not terribly great refinement, decent power but not great, but also not great gas mileage. It had a lot of interior space, but it was noisy. It ended up being, instead of all things to all people, it ended up being nothing to nobody. Now, the sales were decent, all right, but they were never fantastic. They peaked out at just over 100,000, which was, in perspective, the best year for the Caliber was slightly less than the next to worst year, there we go, of the Neon. 84, 36, 45, 35, 10,000 sales. They just weren't selling enough. And small cars for manufacturers are small profits. They need to sell a ton of them to make a lot of money. And this was a miserable failure after a couple of years. Reviews weren't fair. But here's what I found interesting. Is in this research, as I've gone and looked at reviews, people looking back, there's so many people who still own their Caliber and have had great service. They love it. They think the fuel efficiency is good. They think it's peppy enough. They love the concept and the flexibility of it. And that's what a hatchback provides, right? But Americans hate hatchbacks. Otherwise, the Golf would be the best-selling car in America. People who own the Caliber absolutely love it. And most of, not all, but most of the reviews I've read are very, very positive, and they absolutely love it. So the Caliber lives on. The platform has become part of the Jeep family with, I believe, the Liberty and the Compass. And you can see that in some of the dash designs. But overall, this has been abandoned. It's been forgotten. The small car for Chrysler was replaced with the Dart, which was based on a Alpha design, as I recall, and it failed dramatically, and they just ended up cutting it and giving up on the market entirely. And that's so sad, because looking back, when the Caliber came out and I walked into that dealership and I looked, I love the concept of it. I love the idea that it didn't sit down super low. I could slide into the seat. I love the idea of the hatchback, 4 seats, open space. I love the idea of it. Forgetting the dealership experience, thank you, Keffer, the interior was cheap. The door panels were cheap. The seat plastic was cheap. That stupid gate shifter that they sat in the middle. It was just ugly. It was just a miserable experience to be in, and it is one of the worst cars I've ever driven. So to me, the Caliber was so close to greatness, but it was starved of research, development, and quality funding in terms of the interior and what they tried to do. I can get over the styling of it. It's a little too, I'm trying to prove something butch to me. But I like where they were going. The huge headlights and the huge taillights. It feels like an unfinished product. Like somebody drew something one night and they're like, well, let's produce that. Instead of refining it down to something a little smoother and a little more refined. Same thing with the interior. I like squared off. The car I have right now is squared off, but this is just silly with how cheap it actually is. It's like they were like, sure. And they took the lowest bidder and they moved from there. They never refined it further. In every single aspect of this car, it feels like it wasn't refined and massaged and made into a world-class product. It feels every bit, and I think defines good enough. And it failed. And I'm so sad for that because it's actually a super cool car that I really liked. I liked it more than the Golf from the perspective of the space and the pricing, but it wasn't nearly as nice. And Chrysler could have had a home run, but they didn't. They tried to straddle too many different genres at once without the funds to really refine it down and turn it into a great product. Otherwise, they could have had a worldwide hit. So let me know your thoughts below, but please subscribe to my channel. Leave me a comment below, like the video, and if I can do anything, or if you have an idea for my next video, please let me know. I'm happy to consider it.